This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Roland Barthes. It's another in my series on the great philosophers. I have two experts that will weigh in on his life and ideas, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Roland Barthes. It's another in my series on the great philosophers. I have Jonathan Culler and Andy Stafford to speak about it. As I usually like to do, though, before we dig into Barthes, I'd like to get a little background about the men who will be speaking about him. So, Jonathan, if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, any books you've written, any lectures you've given, and what your basic views about Barthes are and his import.
Sure. Yes, well, I'm a professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell University in upstate New York. My background is in literary studies. I spent 11 years in England, in the UK altogether, in Oxford and Cambridge, and it was there that I really began working on Barthes. I did a PhD thesis on structuralism, on the use of linguistic models in literary studies. This was a long time ago. This was back in the late 60s and early 1970s. So Barthes was a central figure in that project. And that thesis became a book called Structuralist Poetics, which introduced English and American readers to structuralism, and which has been translated into quite a few languages. And then later on, I wrote a little book on Barthes for the Fontana Modern Masters series, just called Roland Barthes, just called Barthes, I guess. And that was then updated and brought into the Oxford's very short introductions. So it's an updated version of this little book on Barthes. So aside from that, I've done work on literary theory, deconstruction, structuralism, some narratology. I recently published a big book called Theory of the Lyric, a subject that did not interest Barthes at all. And so I've been away from Barthes a bit until the anniversary when all of us, Andy and others, we were all convoked for multiple conferences to talk about the work of Roland Barthes. Over to you, Andy.
Yeah, Andy, if you would.
My name is Andy Stafford. I'm a senior lecturer in French studies at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. So I come at Roland Barthes from a French studies angle, perhaps more than an English and a comparative literature approach. I wrote my PhD on Roland Barthes at the University of Nottingham, having studied for my undergraduate French studies. I also followed the MA, the Masters in Critical Theory at the University of Nottingham before I wrote my PhD on Roland Barthes. So I read Jonathan Culler while I was a postgraduate student, and his work, particularly on structuralism or deconstruction, was part of a huge introduction for me into critical theory. My most recent work is looking at the phototext. I work on the intersection between text and photographic image, something that Roland Barthes, I hope, would have approved of. But I also work in the post-colonial area, in the Francophone post-colonial area, and I look at the short form, so short story, essay, poem, particularly looking at North Africa, writers writing in French, and then the intersection between West Africa and the Caribbean. I do work a bit on the Caribbean in the short form area, looking at debates between Francophone Caribbean and Francophone Africa. That I don't know, not something that Roland Barthes talked very much about. Of course, he worked, I wouldn't say extensively, he certainly went to North Africa, particularly Morocco, a lot, worked with Moroccan writers such as Abdel Kabir Khatibi, and also Zaghloul Morsi. And I've written on the poetry of Zaghloul Morsi, a very interesting poet whom Barthes knew in the mid-1960s when Barthes went to Morocco as a visiting professor.
Well, I've done some other shows on people like Derrida and so forth, and a lot of people get lost in these endless isms of the 20th century, especially. Before we talk about Barthes' life and how he got to have his ideas. Let me just give a general overview because I like these shows to be both for beginners and also for people who are coming with some knowledge of the subjects as well. Barthes is mostly associated with structuralism, post-structuralism. We hear things like postmodernism and all of these isms together. Jonathan, maybe if you want to just start and then Andy can weigh in. For those who don't know, what exactly is structuralism and post-structuralism versus, say, abstract expressionism or postmodernism, just so that we have our feet wet before we move on?
Well, the simplest account of structuralism is to think of it as a study of human activity, but modeled on, it took linguistics as a model. So the task of linguistics is not to interpret English sentences, but to explain how it is that these verbal forms can have the meanings they do. So linguistics tries to reconstruct the phonological system, the grammatical system, in general, the rules of a language in order to account for our pairings of noise, sounds, and meanings, for example. So that's essentially what structuralism was doing. Instead of setting out to interpret human productions, texts, images, etc., was asking what makes these things intelligible, what are our assumptions, what are our interpretive procedures that enable us to make sense of things. Barthes says that the task of structuralism is not to interpret texts, but to ask how meaning is possible, at what costs, and in what ways. So structuralism focused not only on literary works, but also one of Barthes' first books was called Mythologies. It was about a lot of publicity, images, things, all kinds of ways in which we invest objects with meaning in daily life. So that was certainly a major figure in structuralism, but the most striking thing about that for me is that he was always sort of on the move, reluctant to attach himself to any particular ism, and so would soon begin making fun of himself and his structuralist theories and language and oppositions, and so it was easy then to characterize him as a post-structuralist, as someone who was giving up on this project of a quasi-scientific account of the production of meaning in human societies, and someone who was devoting himself to pleasure, to images, to all kinds of other things.
Andy?
I think Jonathan's point is really important about Roland Barthes moving from one set of explanations, if you like, to another quite regularly, and there's this kind of constant restlessness in what Barthes does. And to pin him into a particular ism, I think Jonathan and I, I'm sure, would agree, is a very dangerous thing to do. And I think Barthes was very aware that he didn't want to be pinned down to any kind of ism that we can try and think of. And that would suggest to me that the most important one, which I would question, is the idea that Roland Barthes is primarily linked to postmodernism. I don't think, certainly postmodernism hadn't really started chronologically until Barthes died in 1980. Postmodernism's heyday, I would argue, the 1980s onwards. Barthes dies in 1980. And I would suggest that we should stop possibly at where Jonathan suggested that Barthes could be put within post-structuralism. The reason why I say that is that within post-structuralism is the reflection on self. And in the 1970s, we seem to be working backwards through Barthes' life here, in the 1970s, Barthes was very concerned with image, with a capital I, what we all as individuals look like, and I think Jonathan and I must have brushed our hair today so that we can have our particular image on this interview, but what the self looks like in a complex, media-saturated, but also contradictory world that we all inhabit, particularly as intellectuals and academics. What does the self look like? And most of the 1970s, Barthes was seen to be concerned with, not in an egocentric way, in a kind of experimental way, with how to present the self and how to consider the self, but also how to look at the self as I say, not in an egotistical way, but in a kind of experimental and almost pseudo-scientific way. What does it mean to look at self? An interesting topic, I'm sure, in terms of. So, far from me wanting to locate that within postmodernism, self obviously is very much in there. I would stop any isms at post-structuralism.
Well, Andy, you just used the term pseudoscientific. Do you think that Barthes and his ideas have more to do with basically semiotics in terms of as a social phenomena, or do you think it's he has antecedents or rather descendants in people like Chomsky and the putting together of how the brain puts together ideas, hierarchies, and things? Let me start with Andy first.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think when we look at mythologies that Jonathan mentioned, that Barthes wrote in the 1950s, what I think is really interesting in there is, of course, the way in which he's addressing social phenomena, as you said, French social phenomena of the 1950s. But I think what's perhaps more interesting is this social psychology that Barthes seems to be interested in. How does the mind, or the collective mind, if you like, persuade itself, operate a kind of mystification? I think he's suggesting that. It's not the phenomena themselves which mystify, it's the human mind that seems, perhaps in an alienated way, that needs to tell itself stories. And those stories are, of course, about washing powders being different from other washing powders, about colonial images, whatever it is that mythology covers. So I think Barthes is very much interested in how we perceive things. And in that, he's kind of close to the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, of Sartre. Sartre is such a big influence on the early Barthes. I feel like the first text that Barthes wrote, Le Degré Zéro de l'écriture, Writing Degree Zero, in 1953, was a direct response to the way in which Sartre, in 1947, had described what is literature and what are the audiences for different literature. So Barthes is always responding to that, not only phenomenological, but also the political side of social psychology. And Sartre, we know, was very interested in those areas. Barthes' final book, Camera Lucida, is dedicated to Sartre's 1938 essay, L'Imaginaire, the Imaginary. And Sartre is somebody that we would ignore at our peril in terms of Barthes' way of thinking. Particularly, I think, in terms of the committed intellectual, which is an important figure for Barthes. Even though Barthes seems to slip away from militancy, even as an intellectual, his early work, which I spent many years of my postgraduate work looking at, is saturated by a Marxist or Marxian approach to social psychology.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts on Barthes' influence, either more on the sociological side or more on the science side?
Yeah. Well, I think probably the most important point here is that science means something quite different in English from what it means in French. It's what science means in French, or even Wissenschaft in German. So Barthes did speak when writing about literature in a little book called Criticism and Truth. He distinguished between criticism, which tries to interpret, and what he called science de la littérature, a science of literature. But in English, that's sort of a paradox. That's sort of a non sequitur to talk about a science of literature. What we speak of is poetics, for example. What Barthes meant by science of literature was an attempt to investigate the conventions of literary works, how readers go about making sense. What are the codes that signal things to them in literary works? How does irony function in a literary work? Or how do we construct characters out of all these little details that a novel presents to us? So for us in English, that's not science. That's something like poetics. On the other hand, Andy's point is a very good one. That Barthes was very much interested in how people make our world intelligible. And the early work, the mythologies, even though there's a very Marxism appears in a very light way. There's still that fundamental critique of bourgeois society and its ways of persuading itself that it is the natural form of human behavior and human society. So that's certainly very important. But I think the link resemblance to Chomsky only goes insofar only goes a little ways, and that's that Chomsky too was interested in understanding, working out the nature of a signifying system like language, and Barthes was too. But Barthes' approach to it was certainly not to try to find universal structures of the human mind, or to proceed in the kind of scientific way that Chomsky attempted.
Well, let's talk a bit about where he came from. What type of family did he come from? He came from the Normandy area of France. Was his family rich? Were they merchants? Were they academics? Were they wannabe artists? Or what is the background, Jonathan, if you want to go?
Sure. Well, Barthes' father was killed in World War I when he was very young, is that right? World War I? Yeah, World War I, yes, of course. Anyway, so Barthes grew up with a single parent. His mother was worked as a bookbinder, and so they moved to Paris. Mother's family, I think, was from the Southwest, and his father was from the Normandy area. But so they moved to Paris, and Barthes speaks of his school years as really characterized by a kind of petit bourgeois poverty, that scrimping to save money for shoes and clothes, and couldn't buy the books in school. So he spoke of his adolescence, really as childhood and adolescence, as characterized by that kind of poverty. Then the big event in his life, really a determining event, was that he contracted tuberculosis, and so ended up spending the World War II in the sanatorium in the Alps. Which meant both that he missed out on the usual academic career of a bright person with ambitions. He couldn't go to the École Normale or attempt the competitions for different places, but also, of course, he missed the experience of the war and the privations of the war and the resistance too. But that was certainly something that marked him very much as a sort of outsider. So eventually, of course, he achieved a certain ease, but even before he did that, partly because of his lack of a regular academic career, he had a significant period of what he called euphemistically professional instability, where he was applying for minor grants and get a scholarship and would lose the scholarship and would do some teaching here and there. Finally, he got an ongoing position at the École des Hautes Études in Paris, and then eventually became professor at the Collège de France, which is the highest academic honor in France. So by the end of his life, he was well off, and could afford all the British tweed jackets and things of that sort that he liked. But for a considerable period of his life, he was not a star, shall we say, and lived in a certain amount of with a certain amount of difficulty.
Andy, let me ask you, what were Barthes' influences, both in terms of the arts, in terms of philosophy, and anything else that contributed, maybe political philosophy? I don't know, was he a reader of anarchist texts? So, what is his background intellectually?
I just wanted, before I answer that question, I wanted to add to what Jonathan said, a very important point,
okay,
which is that, yes, Barthes was lived his early life, first 40 years of his life, in a relative penury, difficulty meeting ends at the end of the month. But in 1954, his rather wealthy aunt, Naomi Revelin, died. She left quite a lot of money to Barthes' mother, and it meant that for the first time, it's quite halfway through his life, if you like, first time that Barthes possibly had a modicum of security financially. The important point, I think, about Barthes' time during the 1940s is that he is staying in a sanatorium in the Alps, as Jonathan said, what he calls, and I love the expression, his alpine optimum. And it's really important to see the Sanatorum experience, which Barthes has written about recently, not yet translated into English. Sorry, it's been published recently, beg your pardon. Some early writings by Barthes, which haven't been translated yet into English. Barthes wrote about his time at the Sanatorium, and actually seems like a moment where he learned quite a lot. And I think that's really read a lot. He read Jules Michelet, the 19th century romantic historian, from back to front, and there he established his famous card system, where he took down notes about the style, the historiography, the attachment to history that Michelet felt. And I've worked a little bit recently on the similarities between what Barthes does with Michelet and what Walter Benjamin says about Michelet 10 years earlier in the 1930s. And then, of course, in the Michelet influence on Walter Benjamin in his 1940 final text, finished text, thesis on philosophy of history. And what comes out from both Barthes' reading and Benjamin's reading of Michelet is this kind of living through history. This kind of idea that the historian writes the past, connects with the past in a kind of visceral, carnal way, is what the word that Barthes uses. And that Michelet is a good example of somebody who writes history but also lives it. And that seems to me to be an interesting philosophical and political idea that comes out of Michelet. For Barthes, this idea that you can be both in the past with the actant that you're describing, and then, strangely, you can also be in the present and write the history from the vantage point of the historian writing in the present. It seems to me that what fascinates Barthes about Michelet is that kind of dialectical approach to the past. You're able to be there and here at the same time. Jonathan's going to enjoy this leap I'm going to make, but I see a similar thing in Sarrazin. When Barthes comes to write in 1970 his seminars on Balzac's rather curious Gothic tale, Sarrazin, Barthes seems to do a similar thing as he has done with Michelet, and that is to be able to see the story as if he were Sarrazin, but also then to step outside as the literary critic, as the writer, looking at the Balzac text, you can see it from the vantage point of somebody who's outside of the text. So I see interesting use, a kind of double vision, not double vision sounds wrong in English, a vision with two capacities or two dimensions that can see two different timescales, if you like, the there and the here.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Andy said about those sanatorium years. That was where there was nothing for them to do except read, basically. And they had little groups that gave book reports to each other. And I don't know if those things have surfaced more, and if that's in the new I haven't seen this new publication, but that would be interesting. He says that he also read a good deal of Marxist writing in those sanatorium years, and that was important, formative for him. But certainly the Michelet project, Michelet's collected works are voluminous. If he had been out doing a regular, aggregation or university studies, he probably wouldn't have had time to read Michelet, which he enabled him to write a little book about Michelet, which was an important step in his career. The question about influences is an awkward one. Najid certainly was an important writer for him. He really was. He did stick very much to the French canon. He was not much interested in English or American literature. Refers to Poe, but that's partly comes to him through Baudelaire. He doesn't immerse himself in Russian novels, as far as we know. It's a fairly restrained canon for someone literary canon with broad taste.
And yet, his MPhil, his DES, as it was called, in 1941, written just before he goes into the sanatorium at the Sorbonne, and we now have a copy of that DES. I've seen it, very interesting, 30,000 word piece by that. So his earliest piece of writing in 1941 is on ancient Greek theatre. Ancient Greek theatre in relation to incantation and invocation in mainly Aeschylus and obviously Aeschylus is theatre as we have it. And it's a fascinating study of the voice, but also the power of the word in ancient Greek theatre. So, although I agree with Jonathan, Barthes' diet is mainly French. That's like Gide, Proust, eventually. But he is a student of classics. He is a classic student in the 1930s, and in 1941 writes this MPhil with a very eminent philologist, which might be surprising for people to think of Barthes working with a philologist, the eminent ancient Greek philologist Paul Mazon at the Sorbonne University. Sorry, John, I interrupted.
No, that's very good. But that also connects up with, one of his major interests in these years was in theater. He was part of a troupe. Was one of the leaders, I think, of this troupe for this theater company that put on Greek plays in Paris. And one of his major influences, whom he writes about a little bit later on, was Bertolt Brecht, who combines the Marxism and the theater. And Barthes was very interested in Brecht, and I think Brecht had a considerable influence on Barthes thinking about literature in general, and especially avant-garde literature and modes of estrangement and alienation in literary practice.
Well, I wanted to turn. It was mentioned two of his early works, writing degrees 0 and mythologies. And one of the things that stands out, just even scanning the topics, is that Barthes would be writing about film, Greta Garbo, professional wrestling, things like this, as well as these classical Greek studies and Aeschylus and all of this. And I'm wondering, did he have any influence, or what influence, let's say, by the 1950s did he have on French culture? Because it seems to me that he would have seemed to be a natural sort of godfather to, say, the French New Wave filmmakers in terms of applying these. But yet you said he wasn't big on America and writing about America, and yet the French New Wave was all infatuated with sort of deconstructing Hollywood film structures. Andy, if you want to go first this time.
Barthes did write a little bit about American culture. Obviously, Charlie Chaplin as a naturalized American. Barthes was a big watcher also of the Marx Brothers. Not Karl Marx, but the Marx variety. There's nothing side to watching these films in the 1930s. Although Barthes is not big in terms of cinema, he's not much more interested in photography, as we know. He did watch a lot of cinema. Particularly in the 20s and 30s, I get the impression, and has those kind of references. Perhaps less interested in the Nouvelle Vague. I can also reveal a strange fact. If you know the Jean-Luc Godard film Alphaville, Barthes was invited by Godard to act. But in terms of French culture, Barthes' influence in the popular theatre movement, as Jonathan quite rightly mentioned, is very interesting. A very strange experience for Barthes. He is, for a short period, not only a Brechtian, but a kind of militant popular theaterist, if that's the word. At that strange moment in the 1950s, when French popular theatre did seem to break through and break out of the usual 2% who go to the theatre. And Barthes wrote quite a lot of articles, travelled a lot around the country, and was in fact employed by the journal Théâtre Populaire for a short period of time. And I've looked at some of the work that he did in the editorial team of this popular theatre journal. Barthes did travel around the country quite a lot in 54, 1955, 1956, arguing for a particular kind of popular theatre. And it's quite interesting what Barthes argues for in terms of how popular theatre could be constructed. And here he becomes quite political in my view. He has a kind of three-pronged view how popular theatre in France could succeed as a truly people's theatre. And his three ideas are that it needs to be a real working class mass popular audience. So there needs to be work done in the factories and workplaces, which is exactly what parts of the Théâtre National Populaire did with its offspin called the ATP, the Ami du Théâtre Populaire. Went into workplaces, tried to get working class people to come to the theatre and break through that usual 2%, which I assume pertains still today in the United States. It certainly does in Britain. It's the usual 2% that go to the theatre. So the idea was to get beyond that. And the first prong, if you like, of that three-pronged attack from Barthes was this idea that it needs to be a working class audience. Therefore, there needs to be restauration, there needs to be food, there needs to be, after work travel, there needs to be, all those facilities that would allow people to come from workplaces around Paris and actually get in to see true popular theatre. That was the first one. The second idea in popular theatre that Barthes had was that the repertoire needs to be challenging. It shouldn't just be, sorry, Alan Ayckbourn, but what's those? I can't remember all the titles. Alan Ayckbourn plays, but kind of kissing, your next door neighbour kind of stuff. It can't be that kind of theatre for Barthes. It can't be just questions of adultery in theatre that you get in the big boulevard theatre, the 1950s in France. It has to be a challenging and radical repertoire. Finally, Barthes says there's one more thing that we need in the theatre. For a truly popular theatre, and he's really thought about it, as you can see, is it needs to be what he calls an avant-garde production. Not avant-garde because he's quite critical of the avant-garde like Ionesco, etc. in the 1950s. It needs to be avant-garde in the sense of finding new ways of producing meaning. So that's Jonathan's excellent point about Brecht, is that it's not just Brecht that Barthes is interested in, it's the Berliner Ensemble, when they arrive in 1954, and the way they put on Brecht makes theatre into this new semiotic, charged theatre that makes the theatre goer more responsible for his or her reaction to it. So it's that idea of a truly working class audience coming to see a truly popular theatre repertoire that talks about the things that matter to them, whether it's the war in Algeria, whether it's poverty, whether it's difficulties at the workplace, whatever it is, or the alienation of capitalism. I'm thinking of the plays of Adamov, a fascinating period. Barthes is a good friend of Adamov at this time. And also, it has to be a challenging, but also avant-garde form of production.
Jonathan?
I don't know much about that. I mean, so Andy is certainly right that Barthes wrote a lot of articles about the theatre and was much engaged in popular theatre. I don't know how much effect that had finally, but perhaps it had an effect. I don't think that Barthes had much effect on French cinematic practice. I mean, that was already going on. The French New Wave stuff was going on, and Barthes was not a prominent critic of current cinema. So I think the major influence that he had on French culture, aside from the Mythologies, is a book that's still in print, that's sold well through the years, and is one of the two that sell best now in the U.S. It's still in print after 1957. It's a very long book. But in addition to it, would really be in the realm of literary studies, where Barthes became a sort of leading figure of what was called La Nouvelle Critique, a new criticism in France, different from American new criticism. And that really started with a book on Racine, which was the product. It was a collection, actually a series of 3 essays, but it challenged. While Racine was one of the great monuments of French culture, and this produced there was a psychoanalytic interpretation of Racine, which outraged many traditional critics and became a succès de scandale, and Barthes was attacked in pamphlets, and etc. And that was a moment when he really did begin to, in my view, to influence contemporary French scene with the shifts in approaches to literature. Not other approaches that Barthes himself was not necessarily actively involved in, but it just opened up the literary scene especially at the university level, in ways that hadn't happened before.
Well, Jonathan, you had mentioned the French New Criticism, and I wanted to ask that I'm familiar with American New Criticism, and The Death of the Author is one of Barthes' most famous works, and in it, he takes what I would say is the common sense approach, is that you can't always read any work of art as an act of biography, because artists by their nature are liars. We're fabulous. We tell stories. And I was just looking up, he apparently got into some row with a professor named Picard. So can you explain what the difference between American and French New Criticism is? Was that label accurately applied to Barthes? And what was the substance of this supposed, I guess, famous brouhaha he got into?
Yeah, well, that quarrel with Picard was the thing I was referring to just a moment ago.
Yeah.
That Picard was a specialist was a professor at the Sorbonne and a specialist in Racine, and he was very upset by Barthes' little book on Racine, and especially by what he took to be psychoanalytic interpretations of these plays. Barthes said that explained in Sur Racine that his goal was to do what he called an anthropology of Racinian man. So this involved Freudian notions of a primal horde and clashes between sons and fathers, and sort of recasting, not focusing on individual plays so much of Racine's, but recasting Racine's world into a sort of Freudian matrix, and that was what was particularly upsetting about the book for Picard, who claimed that we need to read Racine literally. Racine is Racine, and not some scandalous avant-garde writer. And whereas Barthes argued that the task of criticism is to try out the current languages on works of the past, and to sort of experiment with works of the past, see what relevance they might have for us today, and how they might speak to us in what ways. So that was really a sort of a quarrel of the ancients versus the moderns. The ancients wanting us to find what Racine must have meant in his day, and not import modern Marxist or psychoanalytic techniques into the interpretation of Racine. So in many ways, French New Criticism was almost the opposite of Anglo-American New Criticism. A point of similarity is precisely the lack of attention to the author when reading a work. That's one point of similarity. But whereas Anglo-American New Criticism was not interested in psychoanalysis or Marxism or other, what they would have seen as other extraneous ideological frameworks for reading literature, but wanted to focus on the words on the page and what they must mean. La Nouvelle Critique in France was psychoanalytic, it was Marxist, it was phenomenological, bringing various new approaches with their sort of theoretical baggage bear on texts, especially and it was scandalous, especially when it was brought to bear on older texts. So, but Andy, you probably have slightly different to add.
Andy, if you will.
I think what Jonathan said is really important in terms of the way theatre moves into Barthes' work. And then as Barthes leaves the theatre in the early 1960s, that then becomes the key point for him to develop his critical theories. For me, two important things. One is fashion. I'll come back to fashion in a moment. The other is very important, I think, and it sets Barthes up for the rest of his career from the mid-1960s onwards, is that I think he crosses a Rubicon in this period. I think he crosses the Rubicon of not simply being a critic or a social critic. He actually wants to become a writer. I think it's in this mid-1960s period that Jonathan's very clearly set out, where he's having big debates over his work on Racine and bringing these new theories together, is that Barthes uses new criticism, but I don't think is what we would call a new part of the Nouvelle Critique. He wants to move well beyond that, become a writer, so that when he reads Balzac or he reads Flaubert or he reads a particular writer that he wants to work on, by the mid to late 1960s, across May 1968, definitely the author is written in 1968, Barthes is beginning to say, I'm a writer. I don't read Balzac just to be a reader. I read Balzac so that I can more than just rewrite it, but actually write something new starting from it. And it seems to be that Barthes has moved into what Jonathan quite rightly said is this post-structuralist period, where he leaves behind simple notions around structures that have grown up across structuralism from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, particularly with May 68, along with other writers, such as Derrida, as you quite rightly know, Dan, and you've interviewed on these topics, into a much more fluid understanding. Can I just say, one of the important things that's misunderstood or neglected probably in this growth towards post-structuralism is fashion. In the mid-1950s, after mythologies, Barthes works on fashion. He looks at how fashion works. It's a really important part of his career, because he comes up with this really important idea. Firstly, that fashion is written. We don't primarily consume fashion simply with the visual spell it out either in true words or in our brain. So I think it's really important. Photo text. But also, the fashion relies heavily on the detail. That's a really important point for both structures. This notion of the detail. That fashion doesn't simply work with what you wear. It's the tiny additions that change what you wear. And that's so current today, with ladies' women's handbags. If you've just got a particular fashion ensemble, you can offset it, you can redirect it with the simplest of details, such as a brooch or a necklace or a particular handbag or whatever it is. It seems to me that that's struck on something really important there, which is to move away from simple notions of structure to look at how tiny bits of structure can affect the whole. And that's sort of post-structuralism for me, that move towards the micro, from the macro, into a much more fluid play of signifiers.
Andy, would this be related? Earlier you were mentioning his sort of different ideas on different types of writing. Terms like readerly and writerly, or to use a more modern connotations, entertainment versus art, that there's high and low.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in all those different oppositions, and of course, as we know, Barthes always operated via oppositions like the ones you just used. So it's already within his sort of ways of writing and looking at the world, these different sets of different structures, if you like, opposing structures, high and low, etc. You just used. But I think the most important thing in terms of the readerly and the writerly was what I said earlier about theatre, is that just as Barthes wants a Brechtian theatre that encourages the viewer to be the spectator to be an active, critical viewer and not a kind of patronised and lazy, passive viewer, Barthes wants the same thing when it comes to reading. I think that's what happens. He takes that from the theatre from the 1950s and brings it into his critical practice in the 1960s. It's almost like he theatricalises the Balzac story. He makes it into a kind of theatre that he's going to be the responsible, active critic rather than the passive, all-consuming critic. And it's that attitude, I think, that dominates in Barthes' reading and writing. And I insist upon the writing, the rewriting of literary canon and literary text. He often takes the most well-worn and well-known writers, such as Balzac and Flaubert, in the way that Jonathan said, French writers, and not so much sends them up as reads them against the grain. I think that was always the expression that Terry Eagleton used to use. I'm sure Jonathan remembers Terry Eagleton in the 1970s in Oxford, reading against the grain. And I think that is the oppositional, sort of intellectual and left-wing aspect. Nearly all of Barthes' writings seem to be underpinned by this oppositional, anti-dominant ideology, if you like, but also active way of writing the world and writing all the things that he's doing. He's very lucky, I think, to be in the position that he was in the 1960s, with a very low teaching load at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, but also with lots of different jobs to do in terms of being a writer, a journalist, and, of course, an academic.
Jonathan, if you could comment on Andy, and then I also want to bring up, before we start wrapping up on his death, legacy, and give you some final comments. If you could comment about Andy's, what he just said, and also the one other point I wanted to talk about was neutral and novelistic as terms to describe writing. But if you want to comment about Andy first.
Sure. Yes, the opposition between readerly and writerly texts, for example, or readerly and writerly approaches to something, comes from this book, as said, which is a reading of a Balzac story. Readerly is work that we know how to read, that complies with our expectations. The writerly is resistant work that we don't know how to read, and so Barthes says we end up sort of writing ourselves as we read it. What's odd in this case is that Barthes chose what we would usually take to be the most readerly of writers, Balzac, who is given to spelling out whatever no one has ever called Balzac avant-garde. He's always spelling out what everything means, doing it in his novels and short stories. But Barthes takes this most readerly of writers and tries to open up that text. This is part of that process of what I refer to as la nouvelle critique, in which he's bringing, sort of going back to older texts that we thought we understood and trying to open them up and read them in new ways in relation to new concerns. And so this was, again, a cause of outrage to traditional critics who would say that Balzac is not Robbe-Grillet or not one of these avant-garde novelists. So Barthes was devoted at that point to sort of trying to find the avant-garde, shall we say, in older, supposedly conservative texts. That was very important. It's at that point, as Andy says, for me, and Andy and I have slightly different views of Barthes here. For me, the really valuable Barthes is the old structuralist Barthes, who was opening up literary criticism, making discoveries about how meaning occurs. And I'm less enthusiastic about the Barthes as writer, though he's certainly an interesting writer. But that certainly is the direction in which he's going after in the 70s and throughout the 70s. As Andy mentioned, one of the curious things about Barthes' career is that he's always accepting invitations. He would then complain about them, but he would, Playboy wanted him to do an interview. He would do an interview with Playboy. He would write also. He would for art catalogs. He would accept assignments as a sort of provocation to writing, as Andy said. And so when you get the collected works, the books are actually outweighed by, I think, all these articles are sometimes only a page or so, but which he was producing all the time on all kinds of topics. Yeah. So what you wanted us to go?
I wanted to talk just the terms neutral and novelistic as applied to writing. How does that differ from these other bifurcations?
Well, the novel, I'm not a fan of the neutral. I'll leave that to Andy in a minute. He can talk about the neutral, which I think of as a mystification. But the novelistic, what's interesting is that Barthes says that he is in favor. He favors the novelistic over the novel. It's true. I mean, he's not interested in plots and really not interested in characters, not interested in most of the things that people think are important in novels, like the minor incident, and he talked about details, and so he calls that the novelistic, what belongs to the world of the novel, but is not part of its main armature, its main structures. So when he talks in later life about the toys with the idea of writing a novel, he teaches a course at the Collège de France called the Preparation for the Novel, where it's about writers' habits, talks about everything except plots and characters. But in writing about talking about other novels, he tends to pick out particular sort of minor incidents or incidents which he finds effective or interesting in some ways, and this also is what he discovers in his attempts to keep a journal or to record incidents of daily life. Interested in these minor incidents which seem significant but not in overall structure.
Andy, do you have a comment on that? Neutral and novelistic?
I'm going to go straight on to the neutral, if I may.
Yes.
What Jonathan said about the novelistic is absolutely crucial. So just one thing on it. To me, Barthes seems to but he's looking for a new form, a new writing form, and that is the novelistic, which is neither essay, as in the literary sense, the literary essay, nor the novel, but the novelistic, a kind of halfway house, if you like, between a kind of fictional way of writing, but which is not fictional. There's all sorts of issues in what I'm saying there, but a kind of halfway house, what he calls in an earlier text, the bastard option. I'm sorry to use that expression, but that's what he calls it. He calls it in Authors and Writers. He talks about the bastard option, which is neither to be both a writer and the person who writes. It's hard to translate the terms for écrivain and écrivant. Barthes at the end says, well, maybe he doesn't say maybe I'm both, but maybe the aim is to be both, which leads me neatly onto the neutral. Because the neutral seems to me to be an attempt by Barthes to stop the world oscillating in the way that a structuralist like he seems constrained to see it. And that's how he seems to see the world. One of the biographers of Roland Barthes says that Barthes is somebody who oscillates. And taking the antithesis, as the structuralist always does, is a good example of that. Up, down, back, forward, those kinds of antitheses. How the detail fits in there then becomes a big problematic for Barthes in the way that John talks about the detail in the novel. If you see it in a structuralist way, what does the detail do to the structure? But Barthes is somebody who wants to stop the oscillation sometimes, and the neutral seems to me to be a strategy to do that. So, in political terms, Barthes visits with Telquel. We haven't talked about Telquel, but the fellow traveller of the radical intellectual journal in France, Telquel. They go to visit China in 1974, Maoist China in the late Maoist period, all at the expense of the Chinese government. And Barthes writes a very famous, but only posthumously published writings on this visit to China. And of course, in 1974, to visit China and then to come back to France was always going to be sort of going into the lion's den, if you like, because everyone's going to ask you, well, what about China? And of course, Barthes famously wrote in the front page of the Monde, alors la Chine, okay, well, what about China? And what Barthes did was a kind of neutral strategy. He didn't, on the one hand, even though he was disappointed by China, he didn't want to let down his left-wing comrades. So he didn't want to sort of say, he didn't want to dish the dirt, if you like, on China. On the other hand, he didn't want to enthuse in the way that Philippe Solers, in the way that Julia Kristeva did, particularly Solers, had this kind of obsession in the mid-1970s with Mao's China, in a way that was very quickly disabused after Mao died in 1976, and it all came out about the way in which Mao had maintained power. But Barthes didn't want to, on the other hand, look like he was a kind of sucker for the facade that Mao China showed him on his three-week visit. So it was this position of neutral. Position of neutral in 1974 and 1975, which then leads back into this lecture course called The Neutral, where he talks about strategies of the neutral. I agree with Jonathan about it being a mystification, and I'm always quite interested in the way in which Barthes does this. The neutral in mythologies 20 years earlier is a negative category for Barthes. The criticism neither nor. Barthes is very much critical of the way in which popular theatre and theatre is criticised in the bourgeois press in this kind of neutral way. And yet, 20 years later, Barthes is obsessed with it, wants to explore the neutral. And I see what Jonathan means. There is a kind of interesting return of something which in previous writings have been a negative category and a positive category. So that's a typical way for Barthes to work. It's this constant oscillation between forms, between methods, between objects, I would argue, as well, a constant sort of moving to and fro, which allows the neutral to be an interesting kind of third term, if you like, coming out of the 0 degree, of course, it fits perfectly. The 0 degree, this non-oscillation, this stasis, if you like, in which opposition doesn't play out dialectically.
Well, let me wrap things up here. Barthes died in 1980, a victim of an accident. In the near 4 decades since, I just want to talk about his legacy and then give you both any closing remarks. Let me start with you, Andy. What has Barthes' legacy been, if any, and what any other closing remarks you might have about him, and then I'll end with Jonathan.
I want to go back on something I've thought recently, was that Barthes would slowly die a death and that really his ideas would disappear. Jonathan quite rightly talked about 2015, the centenary of Barthes' birth. There was a huge explosion of conferences. It really was an explosion, which is still having reverberations, I think, at the moment. A huge number of conferences on Barthes all over the world, which Jonathan was involved, I was involved, and other Barthes specialists were involved in. And what's amazing is that I am now convinced that Barthes will now be one of France's, perhaps literary theory, cultural theory's greatest writers of the 20th century. I think he'll maintain that, and I think he will be up there with the big French writers of the Camus and the Sartres and the de Beauvoirs. He'll be there, and I think he's kind of possibly got further than Derrida, Foucault, for the simple reason that he seems to irrigate so many different areas. All the areas around the university, a big university that I work in, I don't know if John has the same experience, University of Leeds, there are people using Barthes in all sorts of areas, whether it's health, whether it's law, whether it's fashion, obviously, closely, but much more distant areas that people are using that in. I possibly think that that's been clever in preparing for his afterlife. He always said that the afterlife was a nonsense. We all understand that. We can't ever say how we're going to be seen in the future world. Of course, we couldn't see that. But I think in that kind of second wave that Saussure saw, I think that wove things into his text. I think he foresaw, tried to control in some sense, not in an obsessive way, but trying to leave himself open for future generations to do different things as well. I think he's been canny, and how do I know? I just feel that he's on a wave, and I think that will continue.
Jonathan, your ideas on his legacy and any other closing remarks?
I think Andy's point is an excellent one. That the sort of renaissance, the rebirth of interest in Barthes is due to the great variety of subjects that he touched upon. I was very struck that there was a time in the 90s and the first decade of the 20th century when he had sort of fallen out of view to a certain extent, not so prominent. But in France, there grew up a great Barthes industry, partly because there were all these notes. Barthes kept everything, kept all his papers. There were the transcripts. There were the notes that he had used to write books. There were the seminars that he had given at the École des Hautes Études. There were of course the courses at the Collège de France, and so people were publishing these, editing and publishing these, and that helped to bring him back into view. And then at the centenary, we had people from all kinds, whether they're working on photography or fashion or literature, sort of could find things to say about Barthes. There was a very big conference in New York City, a graduate student conference, which brought people from all over the country. I was amazed at how, because I didn't know many graduate students who were actually working on Barthes, but probably the attraction of coming to New York and for a conference, and everybody could find something to some bearing Barthes had on their own project. So I think that's very important. I'm perhaps not quite as sanguine as Andy about the long-term prospects of his influence. I think he was still a very major figure in the transformation of literary studies, not only in France but elsewhere. And I think that's who knows where literary studies is going in the future. But he's certainly an important figure, and he's a writer, as Andy says, and that's important. One book we haven't mentioned at all, which is the second bestseller in the U.S. after Mythology, The Lover's Discourse, and which is a sort of, he calls it a simulation of. It's not exactly an analysis of what this language of love that people speak that suffuses television, movies everywhere, and literature. He's sort of producing it imitating it as a series of figures. He calls them figures or tropes. So it's a very accessible book. It was even made into a play in France, which is a big play, and that's something that that people find interesting to read. It's just sort of giving us the scenarios of typical lovers, haplessness and engagement with one another. So I think he is a figure who will last.
Let me just one final question to you, Jonathan, since you brought it up. Do you think the reason that you're less sanguine than Andy about Barthes' continued influence is because he did not leave a significant body of, say, creative work rather than just theoretical work? Say, people will look at Camus and that name sticks because of his fiction. Do you think that's the reason?
Yeah, I think I guess it's harder if I try to imagine in 20 years from now what will people be reading. I imagine people will still want to read L'Étranger and still want to read Proust, but I don't know what Barthes they might be reading at that point. Whether A Lover's Discourse is the thing that will last. Are they actually going to be reading essays and to pursue Sarrazin? I don't. That's hard to predict. But I think yes. I think that's part of it.
Okay, well, I want to thank both you and Andy for spending about an hour to speak about it. I will link to both of your university pages. Anyone with an interest in you or him or Barthes can contact you there. And so thank you again for your time.
Well, thanks very much, Roland.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dan, for organising it. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Great to see you, Andy. So long. Thank you, Dan.